Where's Greg? Greg.
Hey, Matt, I'm under the Bel Air.
Why are you under the Bel Air?
Oh, I'm trying to dispel an internet myth.
And which internet myth is that?
Well, that you guys either bought a really rusty 59 Bel Air or that you somehow modified the frame so it would crash worse than it actually would.
So what's your expert opinion?
This is as it rolled out of the factory in 59.
Awesome. So myth dispelled.
Yep.
Is there anything else you want to check out?
Actually, now that you mention it, part two of the myth is that you guys somehow removed the drivetrain.
Okay.
And let's take a look.
So what do you see?
Now, it's a beautiful 6-cylinder with a 3 on a tree. So it's as it rolled out of the factory in 59.
So myths dispelled.
Myth dispelled.
Awesome. So are there any other vehicles you want to check out, or can we get back to practicing?
Let's get back to practicing.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Horn, the Chief Industry Relations Officer for PartsTrader. I'm honored and humbled that you've chosen to spend part of your afternoon with us. I'm here in beautiful Ruckersville, Virginia at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety Vehicle Research Center. And with me is Matt Moore. And Matt, you are the Chief
Insurance Operations Officer.
Wonderful. And as we rolled that initial video, I realized there's probably one or two people left on this planet that have not seen the 2009 Malibu versus 1959 Bel Air crash test, so let's watch it again. Yep, and that's the car we saw back then.
And no modifications.
No modifications. We are as it rolled out of the factory. Matt, so tell us, we're in Ruckersville, Virginia. It's a beautiful area. Why Ruckersville?
We couldn't afford to be in Arlington. So at the time when the Institute leadership had the vision to construct this facility, our offices were exclusively in Arlington, Virginia. And even back in the early 90s, real estate in Arlington was way too expensive. We couldn't afford it. And so we came to the conclusion, a sort of strategic decision, that if we were to locate somewhere in the orbit of the University of Virginia near Charlottesville, we would be able to attract and retain world-class talent and be able to operate this facility. So basically we started driving up State Route 29 and crossed the Albemarle-Greene County line. And once we got into Greene County, we found a place that was big enough and at the right price. And so here we are.
Excellent. Now, as you know, Matt, I've been here a number of times with various member companies. I guess that's one way of saying it. The other one is saying that I can't keep a job. But it's changed a lot over the years.
Yes,
and
it has.
One of the biggest changes is that beautiful dome that we saw. Tell me more about that.
It's a one-of-a-kind structure. It's the largest of its kind. We have approximately 5 acres under cover, and it enables us to evaluate advanced driver assistance systems under very controlled conditions. We don't have to worry as much about rain and moisture on the track. There's lower variability in terms of the surface temperature, and it has no central supports or supports below the cover. So we've really minimized the likelihood that the structure would interfere with radar systems that enable many of the advanced driver assistance systems that we're going to be talking about today.
Excellent. And speaking of that, we've got a pretty packed agenda for you today. We talk a lot about the cost of parts inflation, repair cost, overall inflation, but we're also going to look at some contributing factors like the ADAS and the impact on severity and frequency, the phase-in and collision avoidance system in the car park across the U.S., and also the increases we're seeing in vehicle weight and as well as vehicle power. But first, as we look at parts and parts inflation, I wanted to show you this chart. What we're looking at here is a part-for-part comparison. So this is if there's a fender that's available in the aftermarket, recycled, OE, what have you. It's just a 5-part comparison of the major part types. If you put a trend line on these 4 top bars in the bar chart, you'd see they trend pretty significantly the same, with the exception of recycled, which is actually closing the gap to OE. The outlier here is that purple line on the bottom, which is the aftermarket trend. You can see that it's actually gone down over time in comparison to the rest. Now, that is leading to some parts inflation, there's no doubt, but I think the top thing that's on everyone's mind is tariffs. And we're going to give you an update on tariffs. This is one of the slides. I don't think I've ever revised a slide as much in my life as I have with this slide. But there are a couple of interesting things to point out here. First is that the President has allowed for a 30-day exemption for automakers whose cars complied with the USMCA, meaning they had to have 75% domestic content in their vehicle to be exempt from the tariff. In that same announcement, he also announced that he would double the tariffs to 20% on all goods from China. Now, interestingly, because the U.S. does not identify Taiwan or recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, we believe that those tariffs would apply to Taiwanese goods. I was in Taiwan about 3 weeks ago, and I listened to the Taiwanese economic minister, and he believes that there will be tariffs for semiconductors as well as pharmaceuticals. They're one of the largest exporters of pharmaceuticals, but that he did not see an exemption for auto parts. And as we split out the country look, Canada, Mexico, and the rest, I wanted to look at what I call the back and forth. And this is really a key, interesting point and sort of the unknown in this industry. Canada as a nation is the 13th largest producer of automobiles in the world. They are the second largest exporter by value of vehicles. Last year, 1.3 million vehicles were produced in Canada. So that is a net of $34 billion of vehicles being exported out of Canada. Canada has a lot of contributions, but most of them are in the automotive world for subassemblies and components. And to give you an example of how complex this problem could be, there is a Stellantis transmission module that starts life as a component in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. And between going back and forth to subassemblies, to frame, to completed vehicles, it crosses the Ambassador Bridge 7 times from going from that individual component to a finished vehicle. So the open question is, where does that tariff apply? Where does it get levied? And how often in that back and forth of 7 times does that tariff get levied? The answer is right now, we don't know. The picture isn't much different on the Mexican side. When we look at stamping plants in Mexico, we know that we see raw steel exported from Canada, stop in the US, and then trucked down to Mexico, only to be stamped, welded, and then put back in the US via trucks to various assembly plants as well as collision parts warehouses. So it is a very complex question for Mexico as well. How often would a tariff apply and at what point? So then the next thing is we have to see, okay, what's the impact of this? And a lot of folks were just looking at aftermarket parts as a subset. But really what we see is there are 44% of the OEM collision parts. They're starting off as Mexican or Canadian parts, and they are manufactured outside of the US. Then we said, okay, all Taiwanese parts could be subject and probably will be subject to a tariff, and that 13.5 average parts on the collision repair estimate gave us sort of our base. And assuming that the tariffs are levied against the cost of acquisition of those parts, we looked at the increase in cost on the final estimate paid as $100 to $150 for those Canadian and Mexican OE parts, and then an additional for Taiwanese parts of $80 to $100. So we're looking at anywhere from $180 to $250 potential impact, and that could go higher depending on where and how often those levies are applied. Now, as we transition to the other underlying costs, we want to look at the impact of ADAS, weight, power, and what we call the shifting of the mean. So Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you real quick.
Awesome. So let's talk a bit about advanced driver assistance systems. And we're going to start with a focus on their impact on first on safety and then insurance outcomes, and then we'll get into the mean shifting thing. So the first look from a safety perspective, we were able to evaluate advanced driver assistance systems using police reported data, police information on police reported crashes. And in that data set, we're able to focus on those crashes which are just the ones relevant to the systems. And by that I mean for front automatic emergency braking, we were only focused on front to rear crashes. By contrast, with lane departure warning systems, a crash of interest would be for example, a single vehicle runoff road crash, which they don't happen very often, but they tend to be very severe, and oftentimes those crashes can be fatal. So, big takeaways here, just the tech is good, and this technology is saving lives and is reducing the incidence of crashes. Front automatic emergency braking, any sort of crash, police reported crash, a 50% reduction. And this is when we're looking at sort of same nameplate, same model year vehicle, one with the technology, one without. Looking at automatic emergency braking systems that can detect pedestrians, a 27% reduction in pedestrian crashes. Blind spot systems, really good stuff. People seem to like it. I've yet to encounter anyone with major complaints about blind spot systems. 14% reduction in crashes there, and then an 11% reduction for lane departure warning systems. Now, this is a look at insurance outcomes. And in particular here, we're looking at claim frequency reductions associated with all of the crash-related coverage types. So comp is not in here. We're not talking about theft or animal strike or any of that sort of stuff. And in this set of analyses, actually, this slide summarizes about 100 studies that HLDI's done over the course of the last decade plus. And here we're looking at frequency changes for each individual technology for each coverage type. And the biggest takeaways here is that front automatic emergency braking and rear automatic emergency braking deliver the biggest reductions and the biggest benefits. Now, in that data set, these vehicles are at this point relatively old. And these are sort of first-gen systems. And one of the things I'll point out is, like with lane departure warning, utilization of that system was relatively low. And the system worked, and it yelled at the driver at the appropriate time, but people disliked it, tended to turn it off. In this set of results, these are all later model year vehicles. These are all vehicles now where some of these technologies are standard, and oftentimes these technologies are offered only in bundles. And the biggest takeaway here is that if we start on the far left with the most common bundle, which is forward collision warning, lane departure warning, and front automatic emergency braking, I mean, there's a big lift there. We're looking at a frequency reduction for property damage liability in excess of 25%. And then the chart's a little bit complex and there's a lot of vegetable soup, but simply put, as we move left to right, we're layering in more and more technologies. And the big takeaway is we are getting, for the most part, incremental benefits for each coverage type as more and more tech gets layered in. And then, the sort of the biggest reduction is associated with the technology package that includes rear automatic emergency braking. And there, the property damage liability frequency reductions about 38%. So I know we have a lot of claims folks in the audience, and I haven't said anything about claims severity yet. So let's talk about that. And before I say anything else, I want to say that no one's allowed to say that they tuned into this webinar and said that, and say that I said that ADAS systems are not a big contributor to the severity problem that we have in the insurance and repair industry. The very first study that we did on advanced driver assistance systems was on the Mercedes Distronic system, which was forward collision warning and adaptive cruise control. It delivered big benefits, frequency reductions. But at the same time, it was associated with a $2,000 increase in collision claim severity, and the radar unit that enabled it was mounted right behind the Mercedes TriStar. And so, consistent with the notion that the collision avoidance sensors are responsible for the increases we've seen in claim severity, we do see as we move left to right and we layer in more and more sensors and functionality, the collision severity goes up. Yep. But the wrinkle is the property damage liability severities are also increasing. And when we get to rear automatic emergency braking, there we get the highest increase. So how is it that the repair cost to struck vehicles
Is higher.
is higher for vehicles with the most collision avoidance technology? So let's talk about overall losses, and then we'll get into this whole mean shifting thing. So looking at the changes in collision and property damage liability coverages from an overall losses perspective, we see regardless of what the tech package is, we're looking at about a 5% reduction in overall losses, but we're looking at enormous reductions in property damage liability, and those reductions top out at about 30%, give or take a point or two. Now, back to the whole mean shifting thing. So what we think is happening, and we've done significant explorations of this issue, is that, for example, with the technology like rear automatic emergency braking, most of us are going pretty slow when we're backing up.
True.
And as a consequence, that technology only impacts relatively low speed crashes. And it's incredibly effective. So as a consequence, we're eliminating a lot of inexpensive claims. And so when I'm in a big audience, in front of a big audience, the analogy I like to use is say, if we all stood up and we measured everyone, we'd get an average height. And then if we told everyone to step out of the room that didn't play high school basketball,
That would be me.
and then we measured again, nobody gained any sort of height, but the average would move much higher because we asked the shorter folks to leave the room. And a similar thing is happening with the ADAS technologies. Now, recalibration's an issue, the cost of the parts are also an issue, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on that's driving up severity that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So to round out the discussion, let's just talk about how much is out there. If we look here, we're looking at new model year vehicles. And so here, and we're only counting each quote unquote vehicle or each nameplate as one. So despite the fact that the Ford F-150 sells in huge numbers, it counts as one in this analysis. And despite, and the Bugatti Veyron, well, it also counts as one on this graph. When looking at new model year vehicles, about 78% of all new vehicles have front automatic emergency braking technology as standard. Now here on this slide, looking at penetration across the registered vehicle fleet, and here on this graph, now here the F-150s count as many, and the Bugatti Veyron, well,
Counts as one, a very nice one, but one.
a very nice one, exactly. Our best estimate is that about 28% of all registered vehicles in the US have front automatic emergency braking. And so oftentimes I'm asked, well, why is it we're not seeing frequency reductions, sort of top line frequency reductions associated with this technology, which supposedly is so good? Well, if we think back to the original estimate for property damage liability at 14%, we're getting 28% of a 14% reduction, which is not that big. Now, over time, as the fleet becomes more and more equipped with the tech, frequencies are going to drop. Top line frequencies are going to drop even more. Plus, the technology is evolving and improving. So if we look out, though, the US vehicle fleet is massive, and it's going to take a while until most new vehicles have it. And an interesting wrinkle is that because of this technology, the vehicles with this technology are less likely to total out of the fleet.
Ah.
So that's it in terms of advanced driver assistance systems from my perspective.
Interesting. Interesting. Now let's shift to the discussion about vehicle weight and power increases. And I like to sort of reach back into history a little bit. So we're going to do a comparison of two vehicles. Right here we have a 1967 Chevy Bel Air Deluxe 300. It's a 6-cylinder, and we know that because there's not a V8 badge on the front fender. And this is what I'd call the cheap and cheerful version, right? They bought the dog dish hubcaps, no bumper guards. It has white wall tires. That's probably one of the few options. I'd lay money it has a 3 on a tree. So it's the cheap and cheerful, and it's definitely not weighed down by safety equipment.
Unencumbered by safety equipment.
Unencumbered by safety equipment.
But it does have a cheery color. Do you know what the name in the catalog was for that color?
As a matter of fact, I do. It is butternut yellow.
Butternut yellow.
Beautiful color.
They don't make them like that anymore.
Thankfully, yes. Now we compare that with a 2024 Chevy Bolt EV 2LT, and that comes in literally 500 pounds more than this. That was at the time classified as a midsize, and that's a pretty big vehicle in today's world. And you're like, wow, 500 pounds, but that's not a really fair comparison because EV batteries are very heavy. We all know that, and that's true. So let's take a look at a same vehicle comparison, 30 years apart. So I've chosen this 1995 Ford Ranger because I owned one like this. And you can see that there's, by model, a slow increase as we go from the base XL to the XLT to the 4x4, and then the extended cab 4x4 top of the line. It grows from 2,900 pounds to about 3,400 pounds. Contrast that to the same sort of model spread with the 2025 Ranger, and we see that the base model, and the interesting thing is you can't buy a two-door Ranger anymore, you've got to buy a four-door, and that weighs in at 4,408 pounds and slowly goes pretty steadily up. And you see this big jump up with the Ford Ranger Raptor. Perhaps they should have called that the Porker because it is significantly heavier than any of the other Rangers. And so Matt, you've got some charts for us to look at here.
Yep.
Let's take a look.
And thanks for exploring the Ranger because it sets up the first graph really well, which, from a safety perspective and from an insurance risk perspective, we're very concerned about two things. And it relates to high school physics. It's weight and it's speed. And if you remember your high school physics, force equals mass times acceleration. So anything that causes the weight of a vehicle or is associated with incremental increases in weight in crashes generates a little bit more weight, generates a little bit more force in a crash. A little bit more speed generates a lot more force in a crash. And if you have increases in both, you've got bigger increases. As we can see in the graph in the left, whether we're talking about cars, pickups, or SUVs, weights have been increasing. Now, if you sort of took a blind or uninformed look at the pickup line, you'd think, oh wow, there's, the weights in pickups are dropping. But to some extent, there's been some lightweighting that has occurred in the pickup market. But a lot of that is some new vehicles in the marketplace and also sort of resurgent interest in vehicles like the Ranger. So they're selling in bigger numbers. But the key source of worry here is this sort of parallel increase in horsepower and weight and their impact on the amount of force that's generated in crashes. And the other interesting thing not captured by this is that not only have vehicle prices gone up, which, what's at risk then from an insurance perspective is higher, but like a vehicle like the Raptor, it's a very expensive vehicle variant.
Yes.
We're talking a big delta between the base price of for a Ranger and a Raptor edition, and that's certainly by no means the biggest delta that we've seen in the marketplace. So more and more manufacturers are offering more and more high-end vehicle variants.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was speaking to a Ford engineer who said, we just can't build enough luxury into these pickups. People will buy what we put in there, and it's true. It adds weight, but it also adds to the price. When we look at the distribution of vehicle by type, this is really interesting, and this really did start, we fell in love as a country with SUVs in the early to mid 90s. Before it was just Wagoneers were out there, then all of a sudden the Expedition, the Blazer came on the scene, and they really have increased along with people buying more pickups. And along with that comes a difference in ride height and weight. And you actually had to redesign your side impact test to accommodate this change.
So after the first crash test that we launched here at the Research Center was a moderate overlap frontal test, which was a test you got to see today. Check Greg out on social media later for that. But after that test, we recognized that apparel that was under-addressed was side impact. At the time, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was doing a side impact test where they were using the front end of basically a 1970s sedan. And so if that crash barrier struck a car, it was very likely to hit the door sill, And the edges of that barrier were very likely to hit the A-pillar and the C-pillar and just push the vehicle and not sort of get any intrusion. Well, we recognized in the early 2000s that an increasing number of people were buying SUVs. And we saw in crash data that occupants of cars were at a disparate risk when struck in the side by pickup trucks and SUVs. So in the mid-2000s, we launched a side impact test, and here we see it on screen. And there we were using a barrier that emulated sort of the front end of a Ford Explorer, which was one of the better, if not best-selling SUVs at that point in time. Here you can see the difference in outcomes, one vehicle with a side impact airbag, another without. And so, but we are constantly looking at our data, or nationally available data, fatality data, to evaluate and make certain that the changes we've asked manufacturers to make are in fact conferring real world benefits. And that's certainly true. But what we saw over time was that the risk profile was changing inside impact crashes. And people were still people were dying in good rated vehicles. So we dove into that set of crashes, and what we determined was that those later sort of newer fatal crashes were occurring at higher speeds with heavier vehicles, and the deformation pattern was different than what we were seeing from our original tests. So we upped the crash speed, we upped the weight, and we changed the crush profile of the barrier. And I think here we've got, this is the new side impact test with a really cool set of wheels on the movable, deformable barrier.
But
there
you
you
see
can
that M deformation that really accentuates the impact of the B pillar. And we look a lot at core supports made out of aluminum to save weight, plastic ones that are bolt-on. So yeah, this is definitely, it tracks with the evolution of core supports as well. So the interesting thing too is that we see a change in the distribution of passenger vehicles by size. I mean, here we've got from mini to large to very large, and we actually chose a mini to represent mini. But you see that midsize and large vehicles, especially the midsize, is really gaining in overall numbers. And then we look at a really interesting thing is that the number of vehicles that now are equipped with four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive consistent systems, that adds a lot of weight as well. So that's also in the argument.
It does. And this, to my mind, is one of the more interesting things. It's sort of left out of the discussion, typically around severity. And as you can see illustrated here, we're at over 60% of new model year vehicles are being sold with all-wheel drive drivetrains. And depending on the size of the vehicle, that can add anywhere from 200 to 700 pounds. And even if that were just ballast, that would increase the amount of force in a crash. Increase the amount of physical damage to the vehicle, increase the likelihood of folks being injured. But it's not just ballast. There's additional componentry associated with it. And so there's more weight, more force, and more stuff to get damaged, and then those things bang into other things.
Right, and those components are added to the front end of the vehicle, right? Because it's usually to add front drive to the existing rear drive.
And which is already crowded, and we're going to talk about turbochargers in just a little bit. I don't want to give too much of that away, but yeah.
Incredible. And then we look at, within pickup trucks alone, the amazing increase in large pickup trucks. I mean, this is a lot of weight increases across all vehicle types. So I guess is it time for an automotive Ozempic pill? Seems like we need to cut weight across the board.
I don't. So maybe the Maverick to some extent is at least pickup truck Ozempic, and that Ford Maverick is selling very, very well. And I think this graph is a neat complement to that graph we were looking at with the vehicle weights. And as you can see illustrated here, at about 2014, there's this big increase in the small pickup population, and that's some of what is driving the quote-unquote weight reduction in pickups. But yeah, when I started driving in 1986, my dad had a Chevy pickup. It had 2 doors, 2-wheel drive, 1 bench seat, and that was about it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent. The other thing, too, that we look at is the advent of the electric vehicle, and we know that those are very heavy vehicles over time. So why don't we talk more about the impact of EVs in the car park?
Sure. This is a look at the actual number of registered electric vehicles. And the heavy blue line is the actual number of registrations, and the dotted blue line is the expected growth based on the pattern of registrations that have been exhibited over time. So that's just what the data says. By contrast, the other scenarios are just, assuming the actual growth rate at this point is 34%, and then we took some round numbers and said, well, if the growth rate of new model year EVs jumped to X or Y or Z, where would we end up? And what you can see is that at our current growth rate, by the time we get to 2030, we will still only be at about 6 or 7% of all registered vehicles being electric. And then, of course, if the growth rate increases, we get to higher points. But even if somehow, some way between now and 2030, the growth rate jumped to 70%, we would still be not much more than at 15% of the entire fleet. But you're 100% right. These vehicles are much, much heavier than their gas-powered counterparts. Or I should say, in later model years, the weights of these things are increasing out of step with their gas-powered counterparts.
Now, a lot of folks really think that EVs as a species in the car park are dying out. We look at potential taking away of the tax credits. We know that people have range anxiety, that we may be seeing this faltering of EVs overall. And there are a couple of major underlying reasons. And the reason I bring that up is that Honda is really making some groundbreaking improvements in the EV area. Now, originally Toyota launched the solid-state battery idea, saying that they were working with Samsung and that they would really revolutionize batteries by switching from lithium-ion to a solid state. But the really interesting thing is Honda may have leapfrogged Toyota, and they're saying that in 2025, they started producing in January a solid-state battery, and that could really reignite the idea of people buying EVs. And the reason it's such a big deal is that it addresses all of the shortcomings currently offered in EVs. One is that there is a dramatically fast charging time. We're looking at a 10-minute charging time to charge up to 80%, which is what most people do when they charge their EVs day to day. We're looking at a huge range of over 630 miles. We're also looking at a significant reduction in vehicle weight because of the lighter battery. And because I have an EV and live in Utah, I know that in the wintertime, my battery range is significantly decreased because of the temperature influence on that lithium-ion battery. With solid state, that does not occur. They say that there is little to no noticeable degradation in battery life over 10 years of usage. And they believe that they could produce those vehicles for sale in the US by 2030. That is a big, big shift. The other thing is we know a lot of EVs have a unique architecture from a gas-powered vehicle, but you guys have done a study where you looked at a gas-powered or an ICE vehicle and its direct EV counterpart. So let's talk a little about that.
Yeah. So it's a weird set of vehicles. And this is a set of vehicles that is not a representative sample of the U.S. vehicle fleet at large. So why did we focus on this set of vehicles? As you mentioned, there's in the model years that we've included in these studies, there's a gas-powered counterpart and a direct electric counterpart. And the reason we think that's very significant from a scientific perspective is, if you accept as true that some amount of the variability in crash risk from one vehicle to the next has to do with the amount of ground space a vehicle occupies, its length and its width, in conjunction with the sight lines from the driver's seat, this population of vehicles is fantastic because we've got this head-to-head comparison. So good set of vehicles in terms of trying to ascertain what's essentially electric, what about crash risk And so let's look at these data a bit. So in this population of vehicles, the electric vehicles are heavier, statement number one, and that plays into claim severity. They are more expensive, and that plays into claim severity. We know from data shared with us by Carfax, odometer readings shared with us by Carfax, that this population of vehicles, the average miles per day, far lower than their gas-powered counterparts. So the use case is very different. But after controlling for everything we can control for in our database, and this would include, for example, in collision, deductibles and rated driver factors and garaging location, and that mileage from Carfax, even after controlling for all of that, you can see the claim frequencies much lower for collision and property damage liability. The collision severity is about 1.5 points higher, but that difference isn't statistically significant. By contrast, the 3.5 point increase in property damage liability claim severity is, and that's very consistent with the notion that these vehicles are heavier, and or the possibility, we don't know this to be true, but the possibility that they might be going a little bit faster. But from an overall losses perspective, the overall losses for this population of vehicles for these two coverage types are lower. And we know from explorations of the injury-related coverage types that there's an indication that these electric vehicles are associated with a lower injury risk relative to their conventional counterparts.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So let's talk about the advent of the turbocharger, because that has a special interest for me, because everywhere I turn, I seem to see a new vehicle being turbocharged, and I have a turbo vehicle currently that's a 2022 that they didn't offer previously.
So as you can see illustrated here, if we look at sort of what we do a study every year where we quantify the presence or the population of these primary, what we think of as alternative engines. And what you can see is there's a heck of a lot of vehicles out there that are turbocharged. And some manufacturers have used turbochargers to boost sort of performance, to boost horsepower. Some have done it to boost fuel economy. Some have done it to boost both of those things. But as you can see illustrated here, in 2023, we're at almost 40% of the vehicle population for the 2023 model year turbocharged. The other interesting thing, hybrid and electric vehicles, they're kind of flipping back and forth on a by model year basis. In 2023, we had more new electric vehicles sold than hybrids. We just completed first draft of an update. I'll give away a little bit of the story here, but hybrids in 24 outsold electric vehicles.
Yeah, and we see manufacturers like Toyota betting big on hybrids as a potential better seller in this industry now.
And that's a source of a lot of weight as well. I mean, not necessarily across the fleet, but hybrids weigh more than their gas-powered counterparts. And for the first time ever, the Toyota Camry, it's all hybrid.
Yep.
And Toyota went that way with the Sienna a number of years ago. My wife was in a pretty serious crash this past summer in a gas-powered Sienna. The vehicle did its job. She walked away from that crash, thanks Toyota, but insisted that she wanted a new Sienna, and there were no straight gas Siennas. There are none. The new ones are all hybrids. So I now have a hybrid Sienna.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
As we look at that power and increased weight conundrum, I want to harken back again to our beautiful 1995 Ford Ranger pickup. This was almost exactly the pickup that I owned, which was the 4-liter V6. It was the Cologne V6. That Ford used that across many, many models, Explorers, Mustangs, you name it, they had it in that car. And that could do 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds. Not a barn burner, but respectable back in the day.
Back in the day, yeah.
But now, if you were accelerating at that speed, you would probably get someone behind you driving the newer Ranger, honking at you for not being able to get out of the way. So look at that. We've got a significant reduction in the engine displacement size. It goes from 4 liters to 2.7 liters, but it's 2 turbos, because if one turbo is good, two have got to be better.
Absolutely.
And it does, because it goes 0 to 60 in 5.6 seconds. So that on top of a significant, we're talking 1,400 pound weight increase, still it's able to almost cut in half the 0 to 60 time. That's incredible. So I guess my question, Matt, is, are turbos taking over the world?
Yeah, it seems that way. They're gaining ground, and as we mentioned before, there are benefits from a fuel economy perspective, from a power perspective. We do know, though, however, when we look at collision claim severities, when we look at vehicles with both gas and turbo engines, the claim severities on the turbos are usually 3 to 4 percentage points higher. And again, it's just, there's more componentry in the front end. You know, you've got the intercooler, you've got the turbos themselves, you've got all the plumbing related to them, and then on top of that, many new vehicles are also likely to have all-wheel drive drivetrains.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot more stuff under the hood. And the thing I like to say to folks is, like, if we'd have been at the Bel Air, the '59 Bel Air pre-crash, you could have taken that flashlight and cast a shadow on the ground. You could see road surface through that engine compartment. Pick any vehicle in the facility today, pop the hood, and you cannot see through the engine bay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So what we're looking at here is our projections for where the fleet is going to be in about 5 years. And the key thing is that orange line on the top that's sort of falling off are traditionally aspirated gasoline-powered vehicles with no sort of electric benefit in any way, shape, or form. And so our best guess says those vehicles will be below 60% of the fleet by the time we get to 2030. Over 30% of the entire fleet will be turbocharged. And then, you know, we'll have to edit this tape in a year or two or three, but between hybrids and electrics, they're going to be 5 to 7% depending on the way the next model year or two breaks. And I expect to see some flipping around there for a while.
Back and forth.
Back and forth, yep.
All right, folks, before we give you your takeaways for today, I'm going to remind you that we will be opening up for questions. Please type in your questions into the chat, and we will have them asked to us and answer them as we get them. But again, our key takeaways here for today are that, you know, collision severity undoubtedly is increasing, but beyond inflation, it is the shifting of the mean that Matt explained. It is vehicle weight and power that are also contributing to the increase in average repair severity. The second takeaway is that at this point it is truly unclear what the actual impact of the tariffs will be. It will be there if they stay in place, and that's also an open question. But we don't know how many times when those tariffs will be levied. It could be multiple times, and then our estimates would have to go up. And lastly, we talked about hybrids and EVs, but don't count out the EV just yet, because this change to solid-state batteries is one of those just monumental events, because it addresses the major issues that everyone has with EVs today. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions and see if we have any questions.
We do have some questions for from our audience. So Greg and Matt, you both talked a lot about vehicle weight increasing, and some of that you talked about was due to more four-wheel drive vehicles, more luxury features, electric vehicles on the road. But what else could be contributing? Essentially, why are our vehicles getting so much heavier?
We're buying heavier vehicles.
We're just buying size, right?
Yeah. Oh, but the vehicles are just getting bigger, and associated with that increase in kind of footprint, they get heavier. And you know, like I think if we were to look at the Honda Accord or the Honda Civic, I'd wager that the current Civic is about the size of the 1981 Accord.
I think you'd be right. Absolutely.
And so the vehicles have just they've gotten much bigger.
We got a question that just came in about electric vehicles. How do you all feel about the depreciation of electric vehicles when compared to gas-powered vehicles? And do you see that continuing in the future?
Yeah, as an owner of an EV who has seen a pretty dramatic decrease in value, I say it's depreciated like a fast-falling rock. I think that the change will happen in the difference between gasoline powered vehicle depreciation and EV depreciation when that solid state battery technology means that that car is far more usable. I think part of it is you've reached saturation for the early adopters. They are putting up with the shortcomings of an EV in today's world, whether that's infrastructure or range or what have you. But as we get to that second solid state tier of EVs, I think that'll take care of the depreciation issues.
And we got a question that just came in about that solid state battery. What manufacturer was behind that? Is it Honda? Am I correct in saying that was Honda that's behind that?
Yeah, the automotive manufacturer is Honda. I can't remember the Japanese electronics company they're working with. I believe it's Hitachi. It could be Samsung.
All right, we got more EV questions coming in.
More
so,
EV questions.
Any thoughts right now about how the tariffs might impact the transition to electric vehicles? It might be hard to answer at this point.
Yeah, that's one of the many unknowns because we look at where those batteries are being produced. They're being produced in a number of factories around the world. That could be a major tariff impact. We looked at, for example, one of the EV productions, the Volkswagen ID4, originally produced in Germany, would have been subject to a tariff. Now being manufactured in Chattanooga, Tennessee, believe that's probably close to being compliant with USMCA regulations. It's hard to say.
All right, another EV question for you. Any thoughts about the advanced electric vehicles that are now coming from China at this point?
Yeah, I think anything coming from China at this point is somewhat at risk for a pretty hefty tariff. They are exploding in the rest of the world. I think so far we haven't seen a fully Chinese manufactured EV make it into the U.S.
Polestar.
Yes. There we go.
That's my contribution. Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're right. Polestar, the electric arm of Volvo, that is true. Parent company Geely, made in China. Small footprint so far in the U.S.
Yep.
But yeah, it's interesting. To give you a contrast, VinFast was a Vietnamese company that was importing EVs with a unique idea of leasing the battery separate from the vehicle itself. That car has not really been successful in the U.S., so I don't know if it's the U.S. audience that doesn't want to buy those vehicles, but we'll see.
So another a comment about the Chinese market. So as I understand it, some of the most popular EVs in China are very small form factor, like urban runabout vehicles.
True.
And we don't like that. Regarding our discussion around size, like their biggest selling EV, as I understand it, is smaller than a Smart for 2.
Is that humanly possible?
It is. It is. So but certainly they make conventionally sized vehicles, but they are not available for sale here. But as far as I know, there's nothing on the size on par with, say, a Ford Explorer. Mm-hmm. And those are the vehicles that most Americans want to buy.
Right.
Mid-size SUVs.
That makes sense.
We haven't talked too much about calibration of ADAS systems in this webinar, but we did get a question come in. Are vehicle manufacturers looking towards self-calibrating ADAS systems?
I got nothing there, Greg. It's all you.
Yeah, I have not heard of any manufacturer. It's an interesting idea, and I think it's potentially very possible. When I look at the way you reset a check engine light after you replaced a component, it is truly key cycle time. It is the running of the test system again and again that eventually turns off that check engine light. So could the manufacturers build in a technology like that? That's very possible.
All right, we have time for one more question here. This is about adding all this tech to vehicles. Is there a concern about driver distraction? A lot of these new EVs have all those big screens and lots of different things the driver has to interact with.
You know, it's funny, Matt and I were talking about that there is an EV in the crash test waiting line that has no tactile buttons at all. It is a full screen across the dashboard, And I said, you know, there's a reason that you don't see this technology in airplanes, because pilots need that tactile. When they feel that button, they hear it click, they don't have to look down and double check. I'm not the biggest fan of touching the screens. I think it shows my fingerprints for one, and I don't like that. But also the idea that you have to be scrolling through menus as you're driving another quarter mile down the road, not paying attention to the road.
Yeah, it's my opinion that critical things like HVAC controls, the lights,
Radio.
defroster, all of those things you should be able to operate without taking your hands off or eyes off the road.
Yeah.
And the likelihood of that being able to happen with all controls touchscreen decreases significantly.
All right, well, so that looks like all the questions we have. So I'll turn it back to Matt and Greg for some final comments.
Well, Matt, I think the first question, because I was really impressed, you know, multiple times here at the Crash Center. Can anybody come here?
Well, you can't just walk in.
So no Christopher Walken can come
No
in here.
walk-ins. We're not going to share the address online. But we have a magnificent conference facility. And as you got to experience, we typically, when we have guests, there's our conference room. We want the Vehicle Research Center to be a cultural hub for the insurance industry. And so we welcome groups, and we've got a magnificent conference room there that you saw in the shot. We have some smaller conference rooms, so if folks have a meeting or want to plan an event, we can make that happen here. Typically, guests get to tour our what we call our display hall. I'm going to so that's the display hall, kind of a museum to vehicle crash worthiness and our work. Folks get to see a crash test. We don't make folks drive in the crash test, but on our test tracks, folks do get the opportunity to drive vehicles equipped with advanced driver assistance systems and experience things like auto brake, front and rear auto braking, and self-parking, and vehicle summon, and all that fun new stuff.
I did the automatic emergency braking test. That was a lot of fun. Yep, there you go.
That wasn't you, though.
No, that was not me. I would be the guy. Yeah, that's me, right?
Yeah. So Greg, one of the questions I get a lot when I'm talking about these technologies, and in particular front automatic emergency braking, which I think is fantastic stuff from a crash risk perspective. Folks ask me, well, don't you think it will prompt new drivers to treat it like self-driving technology and just have it brake for them? After having experienced the vehicle brake for you,
yes,
would you want that happening on a regular basis?
One, it's very unpleasant because it's very fast. It is a non-human reaction braking. It is very, very severe braking. But secondly, I think for most people, their survival instincts come to play, and they step on the brake or they steer.
Yeah, because oftentimes that brake response comes fairly late. The vehicle's waiting till the last moment to make sure it's making the right decision. Yeah.
True.
Awesome.
All right, folks, we are at end of time, and I really appreciate, again, Matt, thank you so much for the invitation.
Our pleasure. It was great having you, Greg.
Great to be here. And we'll see you soon.
Take care, everyone.